So let's gather around the Word. I started this series a few weeks ago. It's called The Name. It's all about how the names of God encapsulates who He is, His character, His ways in our life, and what we can count on Him to be in ours. And so we're going to add one of those covenant names today. So a few years ago, a professor of epidemiology at Harvard University, his name was Vanderweel. After being stunned by his own research, he wrote an op-ed in USA Today, and he began with this sentence: if one could conceive of a single medicine to improve the physical and mental health of millions of Americans at no personal cost, what value would our society place on it? And then he began to outline his research that had stunned him, actually, that the mental and physical health benefits that correlate with the person who simply practices their faith. What? In fact, on the most surface level of what it even means to practice one's faith, just simply going to church, he reports, reduces mortality rates by up to 30% over a 15-year period. It's time to come back to church, right? Yeah? But that's not the point. The point is his research found, even on the most surface level of practicing one's faith, that regularly attending services, those people were more optimistic, had lower rates of depression, less likely to commit suicide, had greater purpose in life, more likely to have stable relationships, and more self-controlled. In fact, the research also showed that service attendance, listen, doing this in community rather than private spirituality or solitary practice strongly predicts the health. In other words, doing this in community with other believers. And look, the point of this for me is this, that even on the most superficial level, it is literally healing to pursue a relationship with God in community with other believers. I mean, there is a reason that this research is true, because God is a healer. It's in the teaching series so far. We've discovered God is the great I am, meaning He is self-existent. He is dependent on none other. He's fully sufficient for us and all of our unknown futures. He is the I am. He is God as Jehovah Jireh, the Lord our provider who provides for every need in our life. He is Jehovah Nissi, the Lord my banner, my victor for every battle that I face. And now today we will see Him as healer, And this happens as well. This revelation of His name happens as well in the life of Moses and in the early moments of the people of God's coalescence into the people of God. And so it's happening in Exodus. So Exodus 15, listen to the word of God. The Bible says, then Moses, 15:22, then Moses led Israel from the Red Sea, and they went out into the wilderness of Shur. And they went 3 days into the wilderness and found no water. And when they came to Marah, they could not drink the waters of Marah, for they were Marah. They were bitter. Therefore it was named Marah, or bitter. So the people grumbled at Moses, saying, what shall we drink? And then he cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree, and he threw it into the waters, and the waters became sweet. And there he made for them a statute and a regulation, and there he tested them. And he said, if you will give earnest heed to the voice of the Lord your God, and if you will do what is right in His sight, and if you will give ear to His commandments, and if you keep all His statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you which I put on the Egyptians. For I, the Lord, am your Rapha. I, the Lord, am your healer. Verse 27, then they came to Elim, where there were 12 springs of water and 70 date palms, and they camped there beside the waters. And so this is the word of God. We say that it speaks supernaturally, and so it has a power in it when we just open our hearts and our lives to it. And here we find God declaring himself Jehovah Rapha, the Lord my healer. And so there's a big idea that flows out of this, and watch it. Watch this big idea. The Lord is a healer, a restorer, a repairer, and you can either resist his healing, you can push it away, or you can invite it into your life. That's what this passage teaches. And I want you to watch this big idea unfold before us. And so let's do it this way. First, let's make a definition and then 3 principles. A definition, then 3 principles. And so let's define Rapha, this word, Rapha. What does it actually mean? It's used all across the Old Testament more than 60 times. And if a word is used more than 60 times in the Old Testament, you can grasp its breadth. You can get all that it can mean in your life. And so let me just define that for you for a moment or two. The most basic definition is it means to make healthy, to make healthy. But it's used in so many different contexts. I'm going to list a few just so you get a breadth of the word. The word is used to mean water being purified. The word is used to mean worship objects being repaired and restored. The word is used of ancient people groups experiencing God's forgiveness. It's also used to mean physical healing. It's also used to mean deliverance from something dangerous. And then it's used ultimately in Isaiah 53 for Jesus, the suffering servant who comes to take our punishment on the cross, and by his wounds we are healed. And it's there that we really get what this word is. Ultimately, this word is restoration, our total repair and restoration, but on a much larger scale than you may think. So that's why you should not limit this word to only mean a kind of, physical healing, sort of a kind of a physical healing. And you shouldn't assume that if you're not getting physically healed of something right now, then that must mean God is not a healer. Don't draw that conclusion. Because God uses both healing and not healing to bring what is ultimately good in our lives. I've seen this. It's astounding to me when I see it, but I've seen this happen. A sickness bringing someone so near to God that in a deeper way they come to thank him for it. They'll say something like, I would not wish this sickness on my worst enemy, but at the same time, I am so deeply thankful for what God has done in me through it. And so they'll say something like, I would rather be who I am now with this sickness than who I was before it ever happened. And so look at this. God is committed to your ultimate restoration, mind, heart, emotions, memories, body, and soul. And so he is moving everyone who loves him to that restoration. And it will come to be fully complete when we see him face to face. I think one of the most precious promises of the Word of God in my life comes out of Revelation 21. Revelation 21 is the first scene of the eternal state of when we enter what we call heaven, that is a merging of the restored earth and heaven coming down. The holy city comes down in Revelation 21, and there is the presence of God. And suddenly the presence of God, the holy, incredible, majestic presence of God is around us, and everyone is transformed in just the most amazing way. And then there is that list of the no mores and the no longers. No more any pain or suffering or dying. No more grieving. No longer any tears. And then God declares, I, verse 5, am making all things new. There's his activity ultimately to be completed when we see him face to face. That is his activity in your life too, if you're open to it. He is making all things new. But how? How do I invite His healing activity into my life. There's definition, now principles. Watch the principles. Number one, there's a way of resisting it. The passage is just showing us there's a way of resisting God's restoring and healing activity in your life. And that's what's happening in those first three verses, verses 22 through 24. Moses led Israel from the Red Sea, and they went into the wilderness 3 days. Now, this is going to show us a way. This is going to show us a way to resist God's healing activity in your life. But you got to get the context. And the context is this. They're only 3 days removed from the most incredible delivering miracle of the Old Testament, the deliverance at the Red Sea. Here they are, pinned between an attacking Egyptian army and the Red Sea itself. And God calls on Moses to lift up the staff of God, that focal point of the power of God in their community's life, to lift it up and open the sea. And God does that. Moses lifts up the staff, and the water piles backwards, and they escape through, and then it destroys the Egyptian army. They've witnessed the most astounding display of God's power in Old Testament history. And then just 3 days later, verse 24, the people grumble. They complain. They're angry. And unfortunately, this became the habitual response every time they face something hard. On 6 separate occasions in the Pentateuch, the people grumble. It happened mostly when they got hungry or thirsty in the desert, or when they thought God was asking too much of them. In fact, even on a couple of times, they threatened to stone Moses to death. They're so full of complaint and bitterness and anger. And for them, their bitterness flared when their circumstances got hard. Now think about that for a second. There are different sources of bitterness that can come and go in our lives. This one is when our circumstances get hard. Their response, the way they were resisting God's restoring activity in their life, is that they were responding with bitterness. And what would be the source of that? Look at what I've tried to draw the picture for you. They've just experienced the most miraculous deliverance in the Old Testament, and 3 days later, they're complaining against God. I mean, it could be that their rescue and liberation had created a brand new expectation in their life. We were slaves, and we lived in slavery almost 400 years, and looking out from our slavery, we see our captors, and their lives look perfect. So when I'm freed, my life's going to be perfect too. If you're past 40, you know the lie that is, right? Right? The thing that fights against healing is inward. It's when bitterness becomes your way of response to hard things. Check that. And you and I do that too. We make our desires, our ambitions, our religion. We think that attaining the next thing will be everything that makes our lives meaningful and joyful and free. And it might be the dream job that you're working toward. It might be finding that one to be your spouse. It might be the moment that your net worth has as many zeros and commas in it that you want, right? Or it could be 100 other things. And when that thing doesn't answer every hunger, and that thing doesn't transform us in some miraculous way, we get bitter because we've centered our life on something other than the one who can actually transform us. A life not centered on God ultimately will lead to bitterness. Building our lives on something besides God not only hurts us if we don't get the desires of our heart, but it also will disappoint us if we do get the flat, earthly desires of our life. Very few people ever get their wildest dreams fulfilled in life. And so most of us live with an illusion that if we were to become as successful, if we were to become as rich, if we were to become as famous or whatever it is that is your thing, then I'll finally get happiness and I'll finally be fulfilled. But that's not how life works. So I've told you in years past about a journalist I read about in New York City who had known for a period of time, had known several really huge celebrities before they became well-known, rich and famous and fabulously wealthy. She knew them when they were working behind the makeup counter at Macy's or waitressing or selling movie tickets from a box office. But when they became, she writes, when they became incredibly successful beyond their wildest dreams, every one of them, she writes, every one of them became more angry, more agitated, more unhappy, more unstable than they had been when they were frantic to get to the top. And why? Why? She writes, I'm going to quote her, she writes, that giant thing they were striving for, the fame, that fame thing that was going to make everything okay, that was going to make to make their lives bearable, that was going to fill them with happiness, had happened, and the next day they woke up and they were still them. And the disillusionment turned them howling and insufferable. It was a huge disappointment for them to find out that they were not transformed by the new circumstance. And so look, bitterness, people of God's attitude, and complaint, the outward expression of that, are symptoms of something deeper. And that is, it comes from an expectation that only good things should happen for me, and the hard things should not come into my life. Let me give you a 40-year experience here. I've worked in ministry, church ministry, 40 years. I started when I was 5, thank you. And working in the lives of people in the most personal way. Here's what I've discovered is a strange discovery. Here's what I've discovered about the very, very few that I've ever known who never really suffered. The very, very few I've known that have never really had hard circumstances or never really had to walk through hard and difficult things. Are you ready for the wisdom of the ages? Here's what I've discovered. They all became insufferable jerks. What? Listen, you are primarily formed by the hard things that happen to you. One way to block God's healing presence in you is to avoid the wholeness that He can bring into your life. And the way to do that is to respond to hard circumstances with bitterness and complaint. Or you could say this world, this existence, this flat existence is not all that there is. I'm not really living for this here and now experience as the goal of my life. I'm living to become who God is crafting and forming me to be because I'm an eternal being and I was created for an eternal existence. And God is moving time and space and He's moving me to my ultimate life in His presence where I will be, where I will become all that He's created me to be. And so my present circumstances now are just training. They're practice for becoming who He's crafted me to be. And so I embrace them for the goodness that God is doing in me. Do you know that bitterness is primarily melted away with gratitude? To actually look into your hard circumstances and say, I don't like them, I don't understand them, But Psalm 119:68, God, I know this, you are good, and you do good, and you're doing good in my life, and I'm waiting for its outcome. I'm waiting for it to be complete in me. That even in the hard things, God is building the strength I need. Absolutely, yeah. There is a way of resisting the Rapha of God in your life. There is a way of resisting it. And that is respond to your circumstances with bitterness and anger. But there is a way of receiving, not just a way of resisting, but there is a way of receiving. And now the next two principles become really simple. If you get the first, the next two are really simple. Verse 25, there is a way of receiving. Look at Moses as opposed to the people of God. Verse 25, then Moses cried out to the Lord. Verse 25, there it is. There's the way of receiving. Moses cried out to the Lord. That word cried out means a cry of distress or urgency. Yeah, I'm saying it. He prayed. He prayed. Moses became, over time, an incredible person. He's not that much in Egypt, and even for 40 years in the desert, he hasn't grown very substantial from the inside out. But over time, as he led the people of God, he became an incredible person. And there was one singular secret to his life, and that is that he was constantly turning to the Father in prayer. You read it all over the ancient story. And so look, here's the deal. I wish there was a way that I could keep you from treating this as a cliche. I wish there was a way that I could keep you from hearing this as a platitude. But prayer is the answer. It is your pathway to healing in so many ways in your life. In fact, Exodus 33 gives sort of a summary of Moses, that he was constantly, here's the summary of his life. He was constantly entering God's presence and speaking to him face to face. It's an ancient idiom to mean intimately and relationally close. In fact, it was so intense that actually glory shone on his face. He constantly turned to the Father for everything, for every need of direction, for every need of guidance, for every need of provision, for every need in a hard circumstance, for every need in any crisis. Moses cried out to the Lord. But it turns out that this is not just prayer, it is a certain kind of prayer. This is what opens the door of God's Rapha activity in your life. I'm talking about in your marriage. That's how practical. I'm talking about in your children's lives. I'm talking about in your own health. I'm talking about the things that badger your inner life in everything. It is a certain kind of prayer that invites his healing into your life. And Jesus describes it. In Luke 11, the disciples see Jesus praying, and it's crazy. They see him praying, and then they just blurt out, "Teach us to pray." It's like they watch Jesus pray, and they go, "Okay, what we've been doing can't even be called prayer. Could we just start all over here and just teach us to pray?" And Jesus responds with a little parable. And the parable is about a man who has a surprise visitor at night. He wasn't expecting him. He's got no food in the house. And so at midnight, he goes to his neighbor's house. Remember, we're talking about first century Judea. That's going to be a man and his wife and their 7 children laid out on pallets in one room. And he bangs on the door at midnight. What did he just do to the 2-year-old and the 4-year-old and the, what? And at midnight, and he says, "Lend me 3 loaves." And Jesus gives us a few more details, but then by the end of it, he says, the man won't get up just because he's a friend, but he'll get up because of his persistence. Except the primary meaning of that word persistence is the word shameless. He was shameless in how he went to his friend. And when you look at the character of prayer that Jesus was saying, pray like this, what he meant was this: it was urgent, and it was shameless. It was urgent, and it was shameless. What is he trying to tell us? He's saying to go desperately to our Father as if he's the only one who can answer. You carry that attitude, that Moses attitude into prayer, and you know what will happen? Verse 25, and the Lord showed him, and the Lord showed him. The Lord will show you the tree. He'll show you. This is the one simple door that opens the healing power and presence of the Father into everything you do. Take everything to him in prayer and don't stop and don't give up. He becomes Rapha, the healing presence for everything your life needs. Repair, restoration, wholeness. And in response, God shows him, he shows him something. For Moses, in that moment, it was a tree. Put it in the water and it makes the water sweet. And you know what? This could have been a miraculous effect. It could have been a faith effect. If you'll just do what I say with this inanimate thing and put it in the water, your faith in me will actually make the water sweet. Or it could have been that God showed him this tree that had the properties, had natural properties that would make the water palatable. The point is, God showed him. Fine if it was a miracle, and fine if it was not a, quote, miracle. God still showed him in response to prayer. And that is exactly the way of receiving Rapha, the Rapha activity of God in your life. Let me give you the last. There's a principle for living. There's a way of resisting. There is a way of receiving. And then there is a principle for living. Verses 25 through 27, God made for them a statute and a regulation, and he tested them. And then he describes all of that in verse 26 and 27. You heard me read that a bit earlier. Suddenly, in verse 25, we see something more important than sweet water. Something more important is that he had been testing them. And God will do that in your life, and he'll do it for the sake of the principle. He'll do that in your life as well. This is a constant process that God will repeat in your life over and over and over. If he loves you, he will test you. And what does his testing do? His testing is to show you your own heart. What would you think about yourself if you were one of the people of God just crossing through the Red Sea and it's miraculous and you're feeling just incredible? I mean, what would you think of yourself? He's got to test you 3 days without water. Now who are you? A complaining, bitter person mad at God because things are hard. And so he tests you to show you what is in your heart. But he also tests us to prove that we're ready for what he wants to do next in our life. Do you get that's why he tests us? He's wanting to advance you. He's wanting to do the next thing in your life. He's wanting to do the next thing with you in your life, but you got to go through the test to prove that you're ready for the next thing. And he knows, listen, he wants to do this next. He knows the plans he has for you, his plans for welfare, not for calamity, to give you a future and a hope. And so this is important. This is so important that he made for them a statute and a regulation. Do you see the words? A statute and a regulation. You know what that means? He gave them a principle to live by. This principle is what will invite the Rapha activity of God into your life. This principle. Verse 26, if you will give earnest heed to the voice of the Lord your God and do what is right in his sight and give ear to his commandments and keep his statutes. Well, I think he's just repeated the same thing 4 times. I will put none of these diseases on you, which I put on the Egyptians, for I, the Lord, am your Rapha, your healer. Put in simple terms, are you ready? The life principle? Obedience brings blessing. Obedience all by itself brings healing and repair and wholeness into your life because I am healer in your life. And when you take on this principle, the principle all by itself can bring the elements of healing in you. I mean, let's make the principle simple. Are you ready? Obedience blesses. Obedience blesses. Does it really? Verse 27, what happens next? They came to Elim, where there were 12 springs of water. How many tribes? 12 tribes to Elim. Everybody gets their own spring, bubbling spring. And 70 date palms, the sweetest fruit of the desert, abundant fruit of the desert. Obedience blesses. Make that the principle of your life.